Hello students. Today we will discuss the topic periodization in history. We are all familiar with the terms ancient, medieval, and modern. These are intrinsically linked to periodization in history. What is periodization? Periodization is a divide which hinges on time and categorizes certain common features and elements of human society. Time is essential to any perception of the past. Without time, we cannot divide the past into any kind of segments or epochs. Periodization is important not only to Indian history, but to histories and cultures across the globe. Now, this idea of periodization actually emerged from the minds of the European thinkers. It was they who formulated a schema of epochs and periodized the past. Their ideas wielded a powerful and almost hegemonistic influence the world over. Therefore, it would be interesting to take a look at these European intellectuals over centuries who formulated the idea of epochs in the first place. The birth of Christ was regarded as a line of demarcation in the progress of civilization. Anno Domini, as the concept of time, became a principal marker in the ancient age. It was in the 4th century that Judaic-Christian ideas emanating from the Old and the New Testaments bonded history with the religious. So this was done in the 4th century. However, this term Anno Domini was really used in the 1st century when we find the Venerable Bede using this term in Historica Ecclesiastica. With the growth of papal authority, this Christian division of time earned greater weight. However, we must remember these ideas were always protean. These ideas were always susceptible to constant change and to reconstruction. So in the first place, religion was important. Later on, we find that cultural trends were regarded as important when the past was judged. Much later, in fact, during the period of the Italian Renaissance, we find Italian intellectuals positing their idea of the ancient and the modern. Here, humanism and liberal ideas and the progress of art was regarded as the principal feature of modernity. In fact, intellectuals like Petrarch and Boccaccio pinpoint the artist Giotto as the harbinger of modernity. Later on, this ancient-modern binary was interjected by Giorgio Vasari, who put in his idea of the medieval. So, it was from the prism of liberal ideas, from the prism of humanism, from the new horizons in science, from the exploratory voyages undertaken during the Renaissance and the Reformation period, that the past was perceived and divided into segments. Then again, we find that economic development began to play an important role in talking the progress of civilization. And this economic development actually brought in the concept of materialism when the past was perceived, when periodization was undertaken. Marxist scholars actually brought in the categories of slavery, feudalism, and capitalism as stereotypes of particular ages. So here was a new perspective from which the past was seen, the past was categorized. Political history was given less attention now, and economic and social constructs came into play. We find another school of historians, the Annals school, who actually referred to three models when enclosing history or time in the path of history. The Annals school talked of man's interaction with nature, of economic and political constructs, and social context of events and people. So these were the ways in which the past was categorized. So what we find that after a number of centuries, the ancient was regarded as synonymous with religion and slavery. The medieval was regarded as feudal, and the modern was classified or regarded as synonymous with capitalism. However, there were certain problems in these classifications, for regarding a particular aspect as the hallmark of a particular phase was not really fully correct, because the trends of one age could well spill over into the other. Apart from this, we find that historians are influenced by many new ideas. There is modernism, there is postmodernism that impinges upon their consciousness. Also, historians and we in general are influenced by political narratives of our time. Therefore, these hallmarks are not applicable to all cultures, all civilizations, and societies across the world. The task of the historian is thus to locate a particular event and put it in context in the chronology of time. Periodization is an extremely fluid exercise and remains a very abiding interest among historians themselves. Now let us come to historical ages in the Indian context. History was initially divided into three phases, and this was done by the British Orientalist James Mill. He named the three ages of Indian history: Hindu, Muslim, and British. The historian Manu Devadevan tells us that this term British was used on purpose to highlight the legality and rationality of this final period, and to project that the earlier period was filled with religious bigotry. From the perception of colonial power, we find that the division of history was actually done from the perspective of the religious orientations of the ruling classes. This did not take into account the other diversities of Indian society. Eliot and Dowson continued their assessment of Indian history by following the path set by James Mill and his utilitarian ethics. After this, we find that Vincent Smith made a five-fold division of Indian history. He added an ancient period or ancient age before the Hindu period and a period of medieval Hindu kingdoms before the Muslim and the British period. This, however, was not adequate to bring forward the true path through which Indian history has progressed, or the proper ethos of Indian history. This tripartite division, or this division by James Mill or the colonial powers, was actually challenged by the nationalist historians. What did the nationalist historians do? They first changed the nomenclatures from Hindu, Muslim, and British to ancient, medieval, and modern. The doyen of historians R.C. Majumdar, whose monumental work, The History and Culture of the Indian People, which he edited, which was in 11 volumes, which was edited by him, and which actually showed the way, a new way in which Indian history was to be written by the meticulous use of sources, was a moving figure behind this change. However, we must remember that the trajectory of European divisions actually remained. They still remain. They were not wiped away totally. According to this viewpoint, the ancient period of Indian history began from the Vedas. The medieval period began from the Delhi Sultanate in the 13th century. The modern period began from the battles of Plassey and Buxar and the onset of the rule of the East India Company. Romila Thapar points out that political change was the dominating discourse in this entire categorization. And the major weakness of the nationalist historians was that they never challenged the tripartite division of the British rulers. Later on, economic factors and social factors came into play, and we know that the scholar D.D. Kosambi, he was a Marxist scholar, it was he who added the economic nuances and many other nuances to historical research henceforward. Later on, we find that there was the identification of subphases. So the three divisions of Indian history were now renewed, were challenged, were redesigned, and we see that historians actually brought into play two new subphases. B.D. Chattopadhyay identified the 8th to the 13th centuries as the early medieval period. According to him, in this phase, regionalism became prominent, and the instrument of the state wielded greater power at the local and regional levels. B.D. Chattopadhyay refuted the idea that Indian history was stagnant during this time. He refuted any idea of lack of dynamism. Instead, he highlighted that this period was extremely dynamic and prone to change. Many historians have found that feudalism emerged in the Indic space during this period. Another period has also been identified, that is 1500 to 1800. This period is known as the early modern period, though this categorization has not been accepted by all. Political and economic concerns changed during this period. Moreover, we find that a new intellectualism took place, international linkages progressed a lot, and we find that transoceanic trade was very important in the economic development of this period. The historian J.F. Richards tells us he, in fact, pinpoints a number of features that can be called early medieval, not only in the context of Indian society, but also in the context of European history and world history. In between the two subphases that we have just spoken of, one is the early medieval period and the other is the early modern period, there was the medieval period of Indian history. Now, medieval India has been regarded as a turning point in Indian history. We see here the major political structures of the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire, which spread their political mastery first over northern India and then over the Deccan. These two empires have been regarded as the overarching feature of the medieval period. So what do we see here? We see a new state structure, a concept of sovereignty residing in the person of the Sultan, a very efficient ruling class which manned an elaborate administrative system, and therefore the Sultanate and the Mughal periods were regarded as the epitome of the medieval age. However, certain fault lines are there in our assessment of this medieval Indian history or this medieval Indian period. To some, these two empires, the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire, with their Islamic ruling classes who came in from Central Asia and superimposed themselves on Indian society, essentially remained the other. Moreover, the turbulence and violence of this period has been enormously highlighted. Recently, this politics-centric outlook has seen a shift towards socio-economic patterns. So variations in culture, language, the rise of the vernacular, etc., have been focused upon by historians who have then provided a more meaningful and analytical assessment of medieval history. Now, we find that there were many emerging complexities in historical ideas, and these came to play, challenging the nomenclatures that have been used earlier. Right? So we find that the earlier nomenclatures were not really accepted by all historians as such. For example, there were many problems in these nomenclatures. We know that the classical period of Indian history from the 6th century BCE to 300 CE displayed characteristics first in northern India and then much later in peninsular India. So it is difficult to actually put forward a generic term to identify a phase where developments did not take place in a simultaneous manner. So what has been done to rectify the situation? We find that innovative and neutral nomenclatures are being used by historians to depict the different periods of Indian history. And here I will give you some examples. For the first millennium BCE, the term early historical has been used. From 300 to 600 CE, the term threshold times has been used. And from 600 to 1200 CE, the term early medieval has been used. So the emphasis on chronology and time is underscored here in historical analysis. Let us now come to the typicalities of the early medieval phase in Indian history. The early medieval phase from 600 to 1200 CE, or according to some, from 800 to 1200 CE, was juxtaposed between the Gupta Empire and the Delhi Sultanate. But this phase has earned credibility in historical discourse. Epigraphic sources and text-based evidence tell us that there were certain important developments during the early medieval period. The formation and the spread of states at the regional level and the transformation of agrarian relations have been identified as the crucial changes that took place in early medieval India. There was also legitimization of political power and consolidation of regional politics and social change. B.D. Chattopadhyay highlights these important features of medieval Indian history. He tells us that this period saw the advent of local states, some of which grew into very significant and important state structures. These were located in major geographical areas and developed centralized, bureaucratic models of administration. Monarchy became even more entrenched in society at this time. It was buoyed up by the Brahmanical order of society. Social stratification also came to the fore. To use B.D. Chattopadhyay's own words, peasantization of tribes, caste formation, cult appropriation and integration were some of the changes that registered now. We also see here the rise of the Rajputs, who had at one time been assimilated with the Huns, the Guhilas, and the Chalukyas as important ruling lineages, which were the principal features of the political processes operating at this time. B.D. Chattopadhyay actually worked or focused more on northern India, right? But he tells us that this transition from ancient history to the early medieval phase was seamless, because some of the features of the medieval phase could actually be detected in the immediate past. So he tells us there was no rupture as we moved on from the ancient period to the early medieval period. Deccan was concerned, the ideas delineated by B.D. Chattopadhyay found resonance in the historian Kesavan Velutat, where the emergence of the state and formation of regions was concerned. Velutat tells us that the lives of the people, the institutions at that time, and religion was dominated by the temple. So everything was temple-based in the southern part of India at this time. The lives of the people were dominated by religious ideals and by institutions, all of which was temple-based. There was general stratification in society, which emerged in tandem with caste-based differentiation, and this influenced the contours of society. A multiplicity of land grants can be detected during this period. We find Brahmadeya lands, Devadana, and Vellan Vegai. Brahmadeya were obviously lands held by Brahmins. Devadana was the land held by temples, and Vellan Vegai were peasant settlements. These things were scarce in the earlier period and developed very fast in the early medieval phase. Kesavan Velutat actually points to economic changes. That is his principal premise. He tells us that certain fundamental changes took place in the economy of southern India at this time, which could be characterized as typical of the early medieval phase. So he tells us that there was a fundamentally remodeled mode of production, and this made a huge change in medieval India, or this was a huge change that took place in medieval India. There was a shift away from subsistence farming. There was a shift away from animal farming. What was focused upon was rice cultivation and the production of surplus. So this production of surplus now helped trade and urbanization to develop very fast in the early medieval period, and it added to the dynamics of this period. Velutat tells us that labor organization underwent a major change, right? Because agriculture proliferated and caste structures and hierarchical structures in landholding became stronger. Extra kin labor organization became the emergent form of labor supply, and what was done away with was the earlier system of labor supply based on kinship, reciprocity, and patronage. So this extra kin labor supply was very important in economic progress in southern India at this time. So this economic change, that is the transfiguration of the mode of production based on extra kin labor supply, was the real change that southern India saw during the early medieval period. Manu Devadevan tells us that the early medieval period of Indian history may definitely stand on its own without being regarded as an addendum to the ancient period. New land control mechanisms developed here, and they produced a strong economic base. We find here that there was the rise of peasant proprietors who oversaw agriculture and the production processes of the time. A new fashioning of kingship also developed at this period. The king remained at the apex of the political system, but he bolstered up his position by forming linkages of loyalty and obedience with the chiefs, local elites, as well as with peasant proprietors. These people were rewarded handsomely by the state for their loyalty, and they were given revenue land grants. In fact, land grants, revenue farming grants, became the standard practice of collecting revenue and other dues of the state. Multiple ruling dynasties emerged during this period based on their control of surplus production. We know of the Cholas, the Chalukyas, and the Gangas, who were the big names, but there were numerous chieftains who asserted their political power during this period. And the important thing here was that these chieftains and these political authorities used their control over agrarian surplus for the betterment of agriculture. They invested in irrigation projects and common and canal systems so that agriculture would improve. Manu Devan talks about certain intangible changes in the realm of ideas. Devadevan asserts that these synchronized with the unchanging quality of life in this new agrarian structure. Now, the predictability of life led to the rejuvenation of the philosophy of predetermination. The cycle of time was divided into yugas, ending with the Kali Yuga. Important texts such as the Puranas, whose composition stretched to the 4th and the 5th centuries, the Rajatarangini by Kalhana, the Musika Vamsa by Atula, the Periya Puranam by Chellikar, which wrote about the lives of 64 Narayana saints, were all composed during this era. In Devadevan's view, many essential features of what we regard as the essence of Indian civilization began in early medieval India. Regional self-consciousness, the vernacular languages, devotional bhakti, and the discovery of zero, all these catapulted early medieval India into a central concern of historians. So, early medieval India remains an abiding focus of historians. It is a very significant time of Indian history which had not been given as much attention as it should have been earlier. This is going to be the focus of multiple studies in the near future. Thank you.